My boss took credit for my work in front of the board, so I let him present my pitch. Until one slide exposed everything. I'm 27 and I've been working at Meridian Industries for 3 years as a senior analyst in their strategy department. It's a mid-sized consulting firm that specializes in helping companies streamline their operations and increase profitability. I genuinely love what I do, analyzing data, finding inefficiencies, and developing solutions that can save companies millions of dollars. The work is challenging but incredibly rewarding when you see your recommendations actually implemented. My boss Cameron has been with the company for 8 years and manages our entire analytics team. When I first started working under him, he seemed like a mentor figure who was genuinely interested in helping me develop my skills. He'd review my work, give constructive feedback, and even recommended me for a promotion after my first year. I thought I was lucky to have a boss who actually cared about his employees' growth. Cameron has this polished, professional demeanor that makes him popular with upper management. He's great at presentations, speaks confidently in meetings, and always seems to know exactly what the executives want to hear. I admired his ability to communicate complex ideas in simple terms and tried to learn from his presentation style during team meetings. What I didn't realize at first was that Cameron's success wasn't entirely based on his own abilities. Over time, I started noticing that many of his best insights and recommendations seemed to echo ideas that team members had shared in our weekly brainstorming sessions. He had this way of taking someone's rough concept and presenting it later as his own fully formed strategy. The project that changed everything started 6 months ago when our CEO announced that Meridian had landed its biggest client ever, Titanium Corp., a Fortune 500 manufacturing company. Titanium was hemorrhaging money due to inefficient supply chain operations, and they needed a complete overhaul of their logistics system. The contract was worth $12 million over 2 years, and success on this project could establish Meridian as a major player in corporate consulting. Cameron assigned me to lead the analysis phase of the Titanium project, which was exactly the kind of high-profile work I'd been hoping to get. I spent weeks diving into their financial data, operational reports, and supply chain documentation. The more I studied their systems, the more obvious it became that they were making some fundamental mistakes that were costing them millions annually. The breakthrough came when I was analyzing their inventory management data at 2 in the morning on a Friday night. I'd been staring at spreadsheets for hours when I suddenly saw the pattern that explained everything. Titanium was using a traditional just-in-time inventory system, but they were applying it incorrectly for their specific industry and geographic distribution model. I spent the entire weekend developing what I called the adaptive flow strategy, a customized approach that would reduce Titanium's inventory costs by 40% while actually improving their delivery times. The strategy involved restructuring their warehouse locations, implementing predictive analytics for demand forecasting, and creating flexible supplier agreements that could adapt to seasonal fluctuations. By Sunday night, I had a complete presentation outlining the strategy with detailed financial projections, implementation timelines, and risk assessments. The numbers were incredible. We could save Titanium over $60 million in the first year alone, while positioning them for long-term growth. I was so excited about the breakthrough that I could barely sleep. Monday morning, I presented my findings to Cameron in his office. He listened intently, asking detailed questions about the methodology and financial projections. He seemed genuinely impressed with the work and said it was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that would set Meridian apart from competitors. He asked me to send him all my research and analysis so he could review it before we presented to the leadership team. I spent the next few days refining the presentation and preparing additional supporting documentation. Cameron and I had several meetings where we discussed different aspects of the strategy, and he continued to praise the quality of the work. He said he was confident this project would be a career-defining moment for both of us. The presentation to Meridian's leadership team was scheduled for the following Friday. This would include our CEO, the head of client relations, and several senior partners who would ultimately decide whether to recommend my strategy to Titanium. Cameron said he wanted me to present the technical aspects while he would handle the strategic overview and business implications. I was nervous but excited about the opportunity to present my work to the company leadership. This was exactly the kind of visibility that could accelerate my career and establish me as a key contributor to major client projects. I practiced my portion of the presentation dozens of times, making sure I could explain every detail of the adaptive flow strategy clearly and confidently. The night before the presentation, Cameron called me at home and said there had been a change of plans. He explained that the leadership team preferred to hear strategic presentations from senior management and that he would be presenting the entire proposal himself. He said I should still attend the meeting to answer any technical questions, but that he would handle all the presenting. I was disappointed, but tried to understand his reasoning. Cameron had more experience with executive presentations, and maybe it would be more effective coming from him. He assured me that my contributions would be clearly acknowledged and that this project would still be a major win for my career development. Friday morning arrived and I felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety as we prepared for the leadership meeting. I'd printed copies of all the supporting documentation and prepared myself to answer any questions about the technical implementation details. Cameron seemed confident and relaxed as we walked into the conference room together. The leadership meeting was held in Meridian's main conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Our CEO Jonathan was there along with 5 other senior executives, including the head of business development and several partners who'd been with the company since its founding. The atmosphere was formal but energetic. Everyone knew this presentation could determine the future direction of our biggest client relationship. Cameron started his presentation with a confident overview of the Titanium Corp situation, explaining their operational challenges and the scope of work we'd been contracted to perform. He spoke smoothly about the complexity of supply chain optimization and the need for innovative approaches to solve modern logistics problems. So far, everything he was saying aligned with our previous discussions. But then Cameron transitioned into what he called his strategic analysis of Titanium's core issues. He began describing the exact insights I discovered during my weeks of research, presenting them as his own observations about inventory management inefficiencies and geographic distribution problems. My stomach started churning as I realized what was happening. Cameron continued presenting my entire adaptive flow strategy as his own creation. He explained the concept of adaptive inventory management, the predictive analytics component, and the flexible supplier agreements, using the exact terminology and framework I developed. He even used some of the specific phrases I'd written in my original analysis, like dynamic responsiveness to market fluctuations. The worst part was how naturally he presented everything, as if he'd personally conducted all the research and developed every insight himself. When Jonathan asked about the methodology behind the financial projections, Cameron smoothly explained the analytical approach I'd used without once mentioning that someone else had actually performed the analysis. I sat there in complete shock, watching my boss systematically steal credit for months of my work in front of the company's most senior executives. Every slide he presented, every insight he shared, every strategic recommendation he made was directly from my research and analysis. He'd taken my presentation and simply replaced my name with his own. When Cameron got to the financial projections showing $60 million in first-year savings, the room erupted with excitement. Jonathan called it exactly the kind of breakthrough thinking that sets Meridian apart from our competitors. The head of business development said Cameron's strategy could become a model for all their future supply chain consulting projects. One of the senior partners asked Cameron how he developed such an innovative approach to inventory optimization. Cameron launched into a detailed explanation about his research methodology and analytical process, describing exactly the work I'd done, but claiming he'd performed it himself. He even mentioned working late nights and weekends to crack the code on Titanium's operational inefficiencies. Throughout the entire presentation, I kept waiting for Cameron to acknowledge my contributions or at least mention that he'd worked with his team to develop the strategy. But no such acknowledgement ever came. As far as everyone in that room knew, Cameron had single-handedly created the adaptive flow strategy and solved Titanium's multi-million-dollar problem. The questions from the leadership team were focused on implementation details and technical specifications, all areas where I had the deepest knowledge. But Cameron fielded every question himself, sometimes giving answers that weren't entirely accurate because he didn't understand the technical nuances as well as I did. When Jonathan asked about potential risks in the predictive analytics implementation, Cameron gave a vague response that missed several important considerations. After the presentation ended, the executives spent several minutes congratulating Cameron on his brilliant work. Jonathan said this was exactly the kind of strategic thinking the company needed more of and suggested that Cameron should present the strategy directly to Titanium's board of directors. The head of business development talked about featuring Cameron's approach in their marketing materials for future client pitches. As we left the conference room, Cameron seemed energized by all the praise he'd received. He actually had the nerve to thank me for attending the meeting and said my presence had helped him feel more confident about the technical details. When I didn't respond enthusiastically, he asked if everything was okay and whether I was feeling well. I managed to get through the rest of that day without confronting Cameron, but inside I was seething with anger and disbelief. I couldn't understand how someone I'd trusted and respected could so blatantly steal my work and present it as his own. Everything I'd worked for during months of intensive research and analysis had been claimed by someone else in front of the people who mattered most for my career. That evening I went home and reviewed all my documentation from the Titanium project. I had detailed email records showing the development of my ideas, extensive research notes with timestamps and draft presentations, clearly showing the evolution of the adaptive flow strategy. The evidence was overwhelming that this was my work, not Cameron's. I spent the weekend trying to decide what to do about the situation. Part of me wanted to immediately go to HR or schedule a meeting with Jonathan to expose what Cameron had done. But I also knew that making accusations against my boss could backfire and damage my reputation at the company. I needed to be strategic about how I handled this betrayal. Monday morning came and Cameron called a team meeting to share the exciting news about his successful presentation to the leadership team. He announced that Jonathan had approved moving forward with his adaptive flow strategy and that Titanium's executives were eager to hear the proposal. He said this project would be a defining moment for our entire department. During the meeting, Cameron talked about his innovative approach and breakthrough insights without once mentioning the actual source of the work. My colleagues congratulated him on his success, and several asked if they could learn more about his research methodology. I sat through the entire meeting in silence, watching my boss bask in praise for work he'd stolen from me. After Cameron's team meeting, I knew I had to act, but I also realized that a direct confrontation would likely result in his word against mine. He was a senior manager with years of credibility at the company, while I was a relatively junior employee making serious accusations. I needed undeniable proof that would expose his theft in a way that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. That's when I remembered something important about the upcoming presentation to Titanium's board. Cameron had mentioned that Jonathan wanted him to present the adaptive flow strategy directly to their executives, which meant he'd need to create a new presentation tailored specifically for the client. This would be my opportunity to set a trap that would expose everything. I started by documenting every piece of evidence that proved the strategy was my original work. I compiled email threads showing the development of my ideas, research notes with detailed timestamps, and draft presentations that clearly showed my thought process. I also created a comprehensive timeline showing exactly when each component of the strategy had been developed and by whom. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. I needed something more dramatic that would expose Cameron's theft in real time during his presentation. That's when I came up with a plan that was both simple and devastating. I would create a special version of the presentation for Cameron, one that included a hidden slide that would reveal the truth about who really developed the adaptive flow strategy. I spent several days carefully crafting what looked like a standard client presentation with all the key elements of my strategy formatted professionally for Titanium's board. But buried in the middle of the presentation was a slide titled Development Credits and Acknowledgements that included detailed information about my research process, complete with timestamps and documentation proving I was the original creator. The genius of this approach was that Cameron would likely review the presentation quickly without examining every single slide in detail. He'd focus on the strategic content and financial projections, but might not notice the credits slide until he was actually presenting to Titanium's board. By then, it would be too late to cover up the truth. I made sure the credits slide was positioned strategically after the main strategy overview, but before the implementation timeline. This meant Cameron would have already claimed credit for the work before the slide revealed who actually created it. The contrast would be impossible to explain away and would expose his lies in front of the most important audience possible. To make the trap even more effective, I included specific details on the credits slide that only I would know. I referenced the exact time I'd made the breakthrough discovery, the specific datasets I'd analyzed, and even the coffee shop where I'd written the first draft of the strategy overview. These personal details would make it clear that whoever created this slide had intimate knowledge of the actual research process. I also prepared a backup plan in case Cameron somehow discovered the credits slide before the presentation. I created detailed documentation showing how he'd stolen my work and prepared a formal complaint to HR with all supporting evidence. If my primary plan didn't work, I was ready to take the issue through official channels with overwhelming proof of what had happened. The week before the Titanium presentation, Cameron asked me to help him prepare the client materials. I volunteered to create the PowerPoint presentation using his guidance and input, which gave me the perfect opportunity to implement my plan. I worked on the presentation during business hours, making sure Cameron could see that I was putting together professional-looking slides for his meeting. When I delivered the completed presentation to Cameron, he quickly reviewed the main slides and seemed pleased with the overall structure and content. He made a few minor suggestions about formatting and asked me to adjust some of the financial projections, but he didn't examine every slide in detail. The credits slide remained hidden in the middle of the deck exactly where I'd placed it. Cameron scheduled several practice sessions to rehearse his presentation, and I attended each one to provide technical support and answer questions. During these rehearsals, he focused on the key slides and never advanced all the way through the entire presentation. This meant the credits slide remained undiscovered and would come as a complete surprise during the actual client meeting. The night before the Titanium presentation, I barely slept thinking about what would happen when Cameron reached the credits slide. Part of me felt guilty about setting up someone who'd been my mentor, but I kept reminding myself that he'd stolen months of my work and was about to present it to our biggest client as his own creation. He deserved whatever consequences resulted from his actions. I also prepared myself for the possibility that my plan might damage my own career at Meridian. Exposing a senior manager could make me unpopular with leadership even if I was completely justified in my actions. But I couldn't let Cameron continue building his reputation on stolen work, and I couldn't let him get away with taking credit for my biggest professional achievement. The presentation to Titanium Corp was scheduled for 10 in the morning at their corporate headquarters, a gleaming office tower in the business district. Cameron and I arrived early along with Jonathan and our head of client relations. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This meeting would determine whether Meridian got approval to implement a $60 million strategy that could transform both companies. Titanium's boardroom was intimidating, with a massive oval table surrounded by leather chairs and walls lined with awards and company achievements. The executives filing in included their CEO, CFO, and head of operations, along with several vice presidents who would be directly involved in implementing any new strategy. These were serious people who'd built one of the most successful manufacturing companies in the country. Cameron seemed confident as he set up his laptop and tested the presentation system. He'd rehearsed the key talking points extensively and knew the financial projections inside and out. What he didn't know was that slide 17 would expose him as a fraud in front of the most important audience of his career. The The presentation started smoothly, with Cameron delivering a polished overview of Meridian's capabilities and experience with supply chain optimization. He spoke confidently about their analytical approach and track record of delivering results for major corporations. The Titanium executives seemed engaged and asked several thoughtful questions about methodology and implementation timelines. Then Cameron transitioned into what he called his breakthrough analysis of Titanium's operational challenges. Once again, I watched him present my research as his own work, describing the inventory management inefficiencies and geographic distribution problems I'd identified through weeks of detailed analysis. He spoke with authority about insights he'd never actually developed himself. As Cameron moved through the slides explaining the adaptive flow strategy, one felt my heart racing knowing that the credit slide was approaching. He presented the predictive analytics component and flexible supplier agreements with confidence, completely unaware that his lies were about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. The Titanium executives were clearly impressed with the strategy, asking detailed questions about implementation costs and projected timelines. Their CEO said the approach was more innovative than anything their previous consultants had proposed, and that the financial projections were exactly what they needed to justify major operational changes. Finally, Cameron reached slide 17. I watched his face as the development credits and acknowledgements slide appeared on the screen behind him. For a split second, he looked confused, then his expression changed to horror as he realized what he was seeing. The slide clearly stated strategy developed by Jessica Chun, senior analyst, followed by detailed timestamps and research methodology that proved I was the original creator. The room went completely silent as everyone absorbed what they were seeing. Cameron stood frozen at the front of the room, staring at the slide that had just destroyed his credibility. The Titanium executives began looking back and forth between Cameron and the screen, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Titanium's CEO was the first to speak. "Mr. Cameron," he said slowly, "this slide indicates that someone named Jessica Chun developed this strategy. Could you explain the discrepancy?" Cameron's face had gone pale, and he started stammering about team collaboration and shared credit, but his words sounded hollow and unconvincing. That's when I stood up from my seat at the side of the room. "I'm Jessica Chun," I said clearly, "and I developed the adaptive flow strategy over the past 6 months through extensive analysis of your operational data." The room erupted as everyone realized they'd been witnessing a massive deception unfold in real time. Jonathan looked absolutely mortified as he understood that his senior manager had just been caught stealing credit for a subordinate's work in front of their biggest client. Cameron tried to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, but the evidence was right there on the screen with timestamps and details that only the actual researcher would know. Titanium's CEO asked me to explain how I developed the strategy, and I walked through my research process, methodology, and key insights while Cameron stood there looking defeated. The executives asked several technical questions that I answered confidently while Cameron remained silent, obviously unable to discuss work he hadn't actually performed. The meeting ended abruptly with Titanium's leadership saying they needed to reassess their consulting arrangement with Meridian. They were clearly disturbed by what they'd witnessed and questioned whether they could trust a company whose managers stole credit from their own employees. Jonathan apologized profusely, but the damage was already done. On the drive back to Meridian's office, Cameron finally broke his silence and asked why I'd sabotaged him. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked him in the eye and told him exactly what I thought about managers who built their careers by stealing from their teams. I reminded him that taking credit for other people's work isn't leadership, it's cowardice wrapped in a suit. He'd brought this humiliation on himself through his own dishonest actions, and he knew it. He wasn't asking because he didn't understand. He was asking because he finally realized the consequences had caught up. Within a week, Cameron had been terminated from Meridian for ethical violations and misrepresentation of work product. Jonathan personally apologized to me and offered Cameron's position as head of the analytics team. Titanium Corp decided to move forward with the adaptive flow strategy, but insisted that I be the primary point of contact for all implementation work. 6 months later, the strategy had exceeded every projection, saving Titanium over $70 million and securing my reputation as one of Meridian's most trusted and valuable consultants. The ripple effect was undeniable. Teams ran more efficiently, clients returned, and even Cameron's former allies fell silent. What I learned was simple. Sometimes the most effective way to handle workplace theft isn't confrontation, it's patience. Let the thief build their illusion, let them get comfortable, and then, with one well-placed slide, one undeniable moment of truth, let the facts collapse the lie for everyone to see.